Hello, this video is going to look at universal credit and its assessment periods. That's the period of time for which universal credit is paid and for which it's assessed. That period's monthly, because that's what the government says is the normal pattern of work for most people in employment. So when somebody claims universal credit, there's a 1 month wait during which their income is going to be assessed, and then there's a 7-day wait before their first payment is made. The date that somebody claims universal credit sets their month dates from then on, so it will be different for each person. And that can have really big effects, particularly if they claim towards the end of a month. Universal credit uses net earnings for its calculations. That's earnings after tax, national insurance and pension contributions. Some people also have an amount of earnings disregarded because they have children or they're disabled. Other income is counted in full. If you're employed, your employer has to send your information to HMRC for tax and national insurance purposes, and that's passed on to the DWP. Self-employed people are treated rather differently. They have to supply their own information to the DWP every month on which their earnings are going to be based. And that's really everything into their business and everything out from their business will decide what their net earnings are. It's this first month's wait followed by the 1 week wait for payment that makes this 5-week wait before people receive benefit said to be inevitable. That wait has received a lot of attention and causes many problems, but it's not the only issue. This month-by-month basis of assessing universal credit makes it very hard for people who have got irregular earnings because of seasonal work or many other reasons to know what benefit they will receive and to get the right amount of benefit at the right time. Self-employed people often have very irregular patterns of earnings, but they also have a thing called the minimum income floor, where there's a notional income at national living wage level set for them, whether they get it or not. That's been suspended for a while because of the CVD crisis. Varying or irregular amounts of earnings will always cause a change in benefit because that's what the means test does. Universal credit, however, can mean that it can be quite a long time between the change in earnings and the change in benefit. But apart from that, universal credit also does something rather odd. It takes people who have absolutely regular amounts of earnings, weekly or monthly, and gives them varying amounts of benefit. Now that makes it very hard to plan or budget. I think it's because the designers of universal credit thought that somebody who was paid monthly would always just have one payday in each assessment period. But it doesn't actually work like that because of the way that people are paid. The DWP say that most people in work are paid monthly, which is true, although people on the low earnings typical of universal credit claimants are proportionately more likely to be paid weekly or fortnightly still. But even if paid monthly, those paydays aren't spread evenly through the month, and the commonest payday for monthly paid people is the last working day of the month, which generally means the final Friday, and that date can vary because of weekends and bank holidays, of course. But universal credit is always fixed in terms of the dates that it uses for determining when you're paid. A lot of claims are made at the end of a month as well. But let's leave monthly and look at what happens to people who are paid on a weekly cycle. Every week, every fortnight or every 4 weeks. What happens to them is that sometimes an extra payment is taken into account during a universal credit period. To be fair, if you look you'll find that DWP point this out on their website. Here's a graphic showing 12 months of the year for a weekly paid person, where the red circles show that 4 times in the year they'll get 5 weeks pay taken into account instead of 4. If you're paid fortnightly, then sometimes during the course of the year you'll have 3 payments of 2 weeks pay taken into account, and if you're paid every 4 weeks, well generally there'll be 2 4 weeks taken into account once a year. This extra week or 2 weeks or 4 weeks pay has really serious consequences. Universal credit is a means-tested benefit, and that means that the more income you have, the less benefit you get. So even though you're actually being paid regularly, universal credit rules mean that it sees you being paid more in some months than in others. It's not easy to work out when these assessment periods with multiple payments are either, because of the way in which different people claim on different days of the month. Here's a table of one of our apps which shows the assessment periods over 2 years and the months in which there are multiple assessments. The first column with red circles shows 5 weeks pay in assessment periods instead of 4. The next column shows 3 fortnightly pay periods instead of 2, and the fourth column will show 4 weekly payments being taken twice instead of once. For people paid monthly, it's even more difficult. It depends upon when you're paid and when you claimed. For a lot of people, if you claim early in the month, well, you will have just one payment a month during the whole time on universal credit. But if you're paid towards the end of a month, particularly on a last working day, and you also claim towards the end of the month, there can be very serious problems, because for them, sometimes one payday in a month will be used, sometimes 2, and sometimes none. Here's a chart showing what happens to somebody who claimed on the last day of the month and is also paid on the last day of the month. The top row shows the number of paydays in each month taken into account, 1, 2, 0 and 1. Move the claim day to the first of the month and they get evenly paid universal credit once a month into the future. Look at that again. Just 1 day's difference in the date of claiming universal credit makes a huge difference in the way in which they are going to be paid their benefit. Benefit based on 1 month, 2 months or no months, or benefits paid monthly on a regular once a month basis of being paid. It makes a huge difference in their entitlement figure. Let's look at an example of a single person. This person is paid on the last working day of each month. And because of that, sometimes they are going to have 1 payday, sometimes 2 paydays, and sometimes no paydays within the universal credit period, because that claim was also made at the end of the month. This chart and table shows the variation in benefit that they will receive because of that difference between £244 and £1,756, simply because of the fact that in some months they're treated as having 2 sets of earnings and therefore lower benefit, while in other months they're treated as having no earnings and therefore a much higher level of benefit. This is shown by the red circle. Things can get even more complicated, however, when other factors come into account. Although government keeps saying that universal credit is a really simple benefit, that isn't the case. It's not just earnings that people can have regularly, it's their outgoings as well. In particular, rent, which universal credit can help with, is often paid on a weekly rent cycle. The government chose not to take into account in each assessment period the rent paid during it, but instead to work out how much rent somebody will pay over the course of a year and then divide it by 12. What that means for people paying rent every week is that sometimes they will get payments of a little bit more than the rent they need to pay during the assessment period, and sometimes a little bit less, because sometimes they're paying 4 weekly payments of rent and sometimes 5. The same thing's true for people who pay rent fortnightly or 4 weekly. They'll get a little bit more towards their housing costs in some months and a little bit less in others, and sometimes they'll have to pay out more rent days than in other periods. So the government's aim for universal credit to look like regular monthly work hasn't delivered. In regular monthly work, people have regular monthly amounts they can budget for. In universal credit, that isn't the case for everybody. Let's have a look at something even more complicated, which is a couple, where both are working, one paid on the last working day of the month and one paid weekly. They also pay their rent on the last working day of the month, which is quite a common cycle. I'm using our reckoner that assesses these kind of impacts, and you can see from it that we've got a table showing the assessment periods on the left, the different pay cycles of each of the couple and the rent cycle and what the effects are. One person paid monthly will see 1, 2 or no paydays during each assessment period. The partner paid weekly will see 4 or 5 paydays during each assessment period, and there will be no 1 or 2 rent days during the assessment period as well. Those 3 different periods have to work together when we're looking at what the effect on the benefit cycle is going to be, and that effect is dramatic. This couple, whose income is made up of their earnings and their universal credit, earn a regular monthly amount and a regular weekly amount and pay a regular monthly amount in rent. But the universal credit varies so much that they are left, after paying their rent, with anything from just over £300 a month to over £3,000 a month. And that's because these harsh universal credit rules insist on viewing their regular income as being variable from month to month, when in fact it isn't. Let's look at a chart that shows what's like. We'll compare this with an alternative later on. You can see the variation in income and the irregularity at which it occurs. Imagine trying to budget without knowing that that's what's going to happen to your income in future. How can it make sense to take absolutely regular earnings and outgoings and turn them into what look like random amounts of benefit? Surely there must be a better way. DWP say that it's too complicated to change this system, but I don't agree. I think there is an alternative. I think there's a much better way that isn't too difficult or too expensive to develop. It uses the same data, the RTI data from HMRC that's already being used, and it doesn't require changing the assessment periods or the dates. They can stay as they are. All that we have to do is, instead of taking all the money received in a month into account in that month, we just use the earnings that relate to that month. The RTI information that's passed across already tells DWP how much was paid and for what period. All we need to use, therefore, is the proportion of those earnings that fall into each of the assessment periods, and that just requires us to identify how many days of earnings there are within each assessment period. To do that, we just need to work out how many days there are in a period, not how many days of work, but how many days overall, and therefore how many days we need to average earnings over. Here's a simple example. This is somebody who earns £500 for 7 days, and that gives us what I call the payday rate of £71.43. For each day in that period, they would have £71.43 of earnings that's used within universal credit calculations. If they'd been paid for 14 days instead, then the calculation is exactly the same, except that instead of £500 divided by 7, it would become £1,000 divided by 14, giving exactly the same day pay rate, but taking account of the number of days that it's applied for within each assessment period. We've developed what we call a reckoner to compare the current system against this day rate periods system that we're proposing, and the figures that follow on from here come from this very simple proof of concept reckoner. It's simple enough to show that it's not a difficult system to develop or to implement. We have to do more than DWP. We have to forecast the universal credit assessment periods over the next 2 years in order to work out the dates that we need to use to assign the earnings. So we're going to put the right amount of pay into each assessment period, where the current universal credit system won't do that. It will put in an extra week, or an extra 2 weeks, or an extra 4 weeks, or an extra month, because of the way it operates, or sometimes it'll take a month out. In the reckoner we do this by creating a grid, a matrix that shows the assessment periods in columns and the pay periods in rows, and that lets us do some quite clever things. We can work out in terms of each assessment period the number of pay days within it, and we can work out in terms of each pay period. This one shows a 7-day pay period sequence. we can work out how many of those days fall within each assessment period. If we look at the first assessment period, that's the column labelled AP1, you can see the number of days of each pay period that fall within it. And the first pay period of 7 days actually has 3 days that fall within the dates of the assessment period 1, while the next 4 weeks all fall within assessment period 1. So assessment period 1, the first month of universal credit, will have 3 days at the day rate for pay period 1, the first week, and then 4 pay periods where all of the money is taken into account, totaling 31 days of pay at whatever the appropriate rates of pay are. The red circle at the bottom shows that 1 week's pay has 4 days that fall into assessment period 3 and 3 days that will fall into assessment period 4. Where both members of a couple are working, then we need to calculate the periods and the day pay rates for each of them. Within the reckoner, we do that by having 2 matrices, one for each person. This is a monthly pay cycle matrix, and you can see the varying number of days in each assessment period being shown by the red circle. Looking across for each month's earnings, you can see how many of the earning days fall into each assessment period, as shown by the second red circle. In order to get to the day pay rate, we first of all annualize the pay for each earnings period and then divide it by 365 or 366 in the case of leap years to get a consistent methodology. As an example, if we've assessed day pay rate of £75 and in 1 weekly pay period 4 days fall into one assessment period and 3 days into the next, then of that £525 total, £300 will be used in the first period and £225 in the second. In the current UC system, £525 would be used in one period and nothing at all in the other. That's one of the fundamental reasons for the huge variations in income that I showed you in the bar chart we looked at earlier. If we compare that with the results that will happen if we use the day pay rate instead, shown here in orange, you can see that the irregularities have been smoothed out almost completely. Using our reckoner, the current universal credit system is shown as creating variations in just the benefit alone from £152.70 a month to £1,610.98 a month for exactly the same monthly earnings. Using the day pay rate, however, that variation drops from about £1,000 a month to £1,137 a month, and most of that variation is attributable to the number of days in different months being slightly different. This day pay method of working out average earnings within a period isn't limited to people who have regular pay and regular periods. It deals very easily with changes in rates of pay and within different earnings periods as well. If we look at this example of a matrix, there are different pay period lengths, weekly, fortnightly and monthly. And there are different days used within each assessment period. The reckoner, as I said, is having to do things which are much more complicated than the DWP system would have to. For example, in order to work out the last working day of the month in our forecasts, we have to take account of the different bank holidays that exist in different parts of the UK. It's not only the monthly assessments that we remain more simple by using this method. Universal Credit has, for example, a surplus earnings rule, which is designed to stop people moving their earnings, either employed or self-employed, into one period so that they lose entitlement to benefit in that 1 month, but gain a lot more in other months. The rules mean that somebody whose universal credit stops because of high earnings in 1 month, if they reclaim later, could find themselves having some of the earnings in the earlier period on benefit being taken into account for the next period in which they claim benefit. That seems to imply that they would have to save money from earnings just in case they ever have to come back onto universal credit again at some point during the next 6 months. If the assessment was being done with a day pay rate instead, that wouldn't happen, because of course the pay would be automatically attributed to the right periods for which it was being earned. There is, though, one slight difficulty with the proposal. There will be days of earnings being used when the payday actually happens in the next assessment period. As the diagram shows, it's very common for work being done in one assessment period to be included in pay that won't be received until the following assessment period. So we have to find a way of allowing for that. And we do that by estimating the pay in advance and then adjusting it in the next period, what's called reconciliation. Reconciliation isn't an unusual process. It's used in the benefit system at the moment for working tax credit and child tax credit, and of course it's also used in the tax system itself when adjustments are often made at the end of the tax year. Most people will have a pretty good idea of what their earnings are going to be, so those can be used. It can also be estimated from past earnings where people have already been doing the work for some time. And for people who are going to have regular earnings, it's only one part of the first month that will need this, whilst of course irregular earnings, genuinely irregular earnings, will need to be assessed each month anyway. Reconciliation in tax credits has caused problems, but that's because it happens annually, and that means the sums can be very large, and of course the difference in assessment might be from a long time before, and people's circumstances will have changed again. Under the day rate idea, first of all the difference will be smaller because it's only one part of 1 month's figures that will be used, and secondly, if there does need to be an adjustment because benefit has been overpaid, well, it's very close to the overpayment itself which will compensate for it. And again, it's only if you get paid too much benefit, if earnings have been underestimated, that it will matter. If you've been underpaid benefit, that can be adjusted automatically. The 5-week wait for your first payment of universal credit has been said to be an inevitable consequence of needing to wait until the end of an assessment period to find out how much income people have had. Well, with this proposal, that's not needed. Universal credit could be paid immediately on the expected income, the estimated income, and reconciled in the following month. So, to summarize the current system, it's messy and it's complicated. It creates irregular incomes for people who've got regular earnings and regular outgoings. It makes people wait 5 weeks to get benefit, causing huge problems, and it has bizarre rules for rises in income that may be taken into account 6 months after you've stopped getting universal credit. In contrast, my proposal, using a day pay rate, proportions earnings into their right assessment periods, evens out the irregularities, gets rid of the need for a 5-week wait, makes surplus earning rules unnecessary, all using the existing data, and best of all, it's simpler than the current system.